Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Giulia Mori, and I am coordinating this migration seminar series on behalf of unu-merit and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The migration seminar series brings together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others to discuss their work on migration-related topics. Before introducing today's speaker, I would like to go through a few brief housekeeping points. So today's talk will last approximately 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for discussion and questions from the audience. I kindly ask you to keep your questions until after the presentation. You can either write them here in the chat, and in which case I will read them out, or use the raise hand function, and I will give you the floor in turn. In the meantime, please keep your microphones muted. You are welcome to turn on your camera if you wish, but please note that this session is being recorded for dissemination via our YouTube channel. And also on our YouTube channel, you can find recordings from previous migration seminars. So now let me introduce today's speaker. We are very pleased to welcome Christopher Cowan. Christopher is a doctoral candidate at the Lund Faculty of Law, conducting research within the Refugee Finance Histories, Frameworks and Practices project, directed by Daria Davitti and funded by the European Research Council. Christopher holds an LLM in International Human Rights Law from Lund University, and his research interests include asylum and migration, finance and development, human rights, gender, and queer perspectives. So welcome, Christopher, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that introduction and for organizing this seminar. It's really appreciated. I'm looking forward to giving my perspectives and hearing what you think. I'm a part of the Refugee Finance project, as Julia mentioned. It's an ERC funded project, essentially looking into the increasing use of public-private partnerships and financing, from my perspective anyway, to support refugee integration across the EU, across key areas in education and employment. And also more recently looking at the path to increasing use of public-private partnerships and financing at the external border, for reception centres as well. So, there we go. So just to give you a brief schedule for today, I'm going to define refugee finance and explain a little bit about the financial instruments that I'm looking at. So impact bonds, social impact bonds, and the most recent focus in the EU is on microfinance. Provide like an overview of the legal frameworks, so the UN Handbook for Self-Reliance, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the Global Compact, and also some EU frameworks there as well. And probably the most interesting for today, I'll go into my 4 case studies. So there are 2 social impact bonds there, the Koto SIB in Helsinki in southern Finland. I've just come from a period of fieldwork there where I was interviewing government actors, investors, and service providers. The Duo for a Job SIB and the Partnerships in Financing for Migrant Inclusion, which is focused on microfinance, microloans, and services to refugees and migrants. And then, of course, we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So how do you define refugee finance? As I mentioned, it's looking at the increasing use of these public-private partnerships and financing, and these are often packaged into financial instruments. So you have social impact bonds, technical assistance funds, refugee bonds, and microfinance. Those are the kind of the key instruments that we're looking into for the project. There's also blended finance, so where different resources are mixed within a single mechanism or facility. So EU grants or loans. Key actors there would include the Council of Europe Development Bank, the European Investment Fund. The microfinance projects, the PAFMI projects would be an example of blended finance, where the Council of Europe Development Bank has come together with DG Regio Home at the Commission with financing from the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. So the idea, right, is to support integration through these public-private financing and partnerships in the EU, as I mentioned, I'm this is part of a bigger project, and I have colleagues that are looking more at the humanitarian development side of things, targeting refugee populations. So they were out in Colombia looking at displaced Venezuelan people and that impact. And really, kind of a core theme that anchors a lot of this is the increasing importance of refugee self-reliance. So being able to sort of claim your integration process through these programs to engage as an entrepreneur, and or to kind of have a fast track effectively to the labor market. So research questions. I'd say about these questions, they're designed in a way to sort of assist me with fieldwork, and I'm sure they'll evolve over time. But for now, it's what are the structural and operational features of financial instruments within the EU? So the social impact bonds through to microfinance. How are these instruments shaping education and employment programs available to refugees across the EU? So often there's a set of predefined selection criteria and KPIs, and this kind of feeds through into the final question, which is the bigger question that we're dealing with in the project: is how these instruments impact the doctrinal and normative understanding of international protection within EU policies. And I would add their international protection as a core legal concept. If you have this increasing use of private financing, private service provision that targets a specific cohort of refugees, which will become clear as I elaborate on the case studies, what that means for protection from a legal perspective, and then also there are issues there at the border and the increasing use of private financing there. So it's trying to capture an EU-wide understanding of what's going on. So I'm engaging in a mapping process, looking at different bonds, microfinance projects that are ongoing, and yeah, trying to map everything that's going on. Then the second stage is this period of fieldwork, which I'm now on. So yeah, set just from Helsinki, where I was looking at the Koto SIB, and now my attention is turned to microfinance and the Geo for a Job SIB. So what are the main kind of sectoral areas? Education, employment, health, and housing. I would say, what I've learned over the past year, at least from a European EU perspective, the real focus is on education and employment, health, and housing is proved a little more difficult, I would say, to engage private financing, private provision. And it seems from talking to people, a lot of that is due to the fact that it's easier to measure success and to hit KPIs when you're looking at employment, right? So if you have within a target group for a program, if there is a higher employment rate after 6 months or a year compared to the control group that just deals with the public sector, then you hit a KPI, and that triggers a payment back to investors from the government agency or the fund manager. And education would be something similar where you can more easily, I would say, see the results. Health and housing, a little more difficult, more focused on the longer term. And there hasn't been much space from what I've observed so far within those two areas. Perhaps there is something there, but that seems to be the real focus at the minute. And even with employment, it's kind of shifted from these more highly skilled refugees who are able to quickly engage with the program and then enter the labor market through to refugee and migrant entrepreneurs. So people with a business background in their country of origin. And if we can provide microloans to them and they get repaid and money gets reused, so it's viewed as an efficient use of resources. So bonds, so looking at impact bonds, social impact bonds, essentially these are there's a type of outcome-based contract. So private funding comes from investors to cover the upfront capital for a provider to set up and deliver a service. A SIB is very similar, it just refers to the social impact, so across objectives in education, employment, or housing. And then development impact, as I mentioned, my colleagues on the team are focused on that side of things. So who are the key partners in an impact bond? So you have the outcome payer. Often this is, so to give you an example, the Finnish Koto SIB, which I'll talk a bit about later on, would be the government and the Ministry for Employment in collaboration with the fund manager. So identifying potential beneficiaries for a project, defining outcomes, and paying for achieved outcomes. So when certain KPIs are hit, that triggers a payment back to investors who, as you see, provide the upfront funding for the service provider for investors. A lot of it is sort of philanthropic. A lot of the money is funneled through CSR departments at financial institutions. A lot of the money comes from foundations as well. And service providers, so those that work with beneficiaries to achieve outcomes. So the people on the ground, delivering a seminar on how to build a CV, on language training relevant to the job market, for example. And then just a little bit about blended finance. So as I mentioned, financing in collaboration with multiple actors, and the EU Asylum Migration and Integration Fund is a good sort of anchor there, I suppose. And there's an increasing focus on microloans to beneficiaries. The PAFME experiments there between the Council of Europe Development Bank and DG Regio Home is a real sort of clear example of that. And within that, there's a focus on a bottom-up approach with a need to build migrant-led businesses. So why is it popular? Why bother doing this in the first place? It's a lot of effort to set up a social impact bond. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. Some of the reflections I've had from different people, they've let me know how complicated it is and how challenging it can be. The simple idea is that, particularly with microfinance, is that you have this revolving effect, right? So money is repaid by the final recipients and can be reused to further support investments supporting the objectives. So there's a saving to the public purse there, which makes a social impact bond very attractive, and microfinance even more so. And a leverage effect as well. So the idea is to show that these instruments can work, that a social impact bond has value, that microfinance has value for integration. And the idea from the EU is that this can attract additional public and private co-investments, and that could potentially be supported with grants, and to really expand the services offered by a social impact bond, or to even provide seed funding to organizations that support refugees. Some of the other benefits. So as I mentioned, it's viewed as a cost-efficient use of public resources. There's a possibility to combine it with grant support. And there's this notion as well that there's a high quality of supported projects. Resources need to be paid back. Often this high quality is defined by the selection criteria for people that come in. So there may be sort of age requirements. There may be a certain level of language may be required at B1 or B2 level to engage with the project. And that's a way to sort of support that high quality that the EU is looking for. And also financial discipline. So intermediaries are kind of focusing to identify and assess a suitable project. Suitable in the sense that there's a social impact for the target population, and also, of course, that a return on investment can be triggered to investors. So I go through this when I have the master's students back at Lund, but just to kind of step back a little bit and to convey that refugee finance, it has its origins perhaps 100 years ago through this concept of self-reliance. So the Turkish-Greek population exchange after World War I, Charles Howland wrote an article in 1926 talking about the industrious and active spirit of refugees to earn their own livelihood. And it's been interesting listening to some of the people I've been interviewing who are passionate about this SIB model. A lot of that language comes through this industrial active spirit, the capabilities, capacities, self-reliance has really come through there. And of course, with the Refugee Convention, which kind of anchors a lot of this research. So well-founded fear of being persecuted. I'll not rehash all of this. I'm sure you're all very aware. And so where does that leave us with refugeehood in the 21st century? So we see an increasing importance of of refugee self-reliance. You have the UN Handbook for Self-Reliance, and it starts to become more of a focus with the 2016 CRRF, the Global Compact on Refugees, and this concept has been readily adopted by financial instruments, which in and of themselves seek to build upon the capabilities and the skills and value that refugees bring to a host country. And there's this idea that there's a shrinking state role. Budgets are increasingly constrained across the EU. There isn't broad strokes here, but broadly speaking, there isn't the money available really to provide integration services that perhaps were better financed in the past, not well financed, but better financed. And these financial instruments, they're often sold as innovative by bringing in private capital. Innovative, there's an argument there, especially with microfinance, it is essentially just a loan, but it's interesting the way that it's sort of packaged and sold at an EU level. It's viewed as innovative financing. And there's increasing focus of academics and practitioners promoting this idea of refugee self-reliance as a way for people to claim their social rights, to sort of claim their protection whenever they're in a country. So just a little bit of backdrop. Of course, you'll be very aware with the funding crisis since 2024 at the UN level. So nearly 1.6 billion unpaid dues in 24. And then the situation has worsened, and there have been some really sort of stark warnings that the UN is running out of money. But this feeds through into like a broader narrative about the importance of private financing and private capital to come on board and support. From some of my colleagues from a humanitarian perspective, from my perspective, at an EU level to support refugee integration, and potentially also to look at the border there as well. So just to quickly run through some legal frameworks. As I mentioned, the United Nations Handbook for Self-Reliance. So it's about advocating for durable solutions and ensuring people don't remain passive recipients of aid. There's a focus on capabilities and the resilience of refugees. And sort of the strategy there is coping with budget constraints, developing donor interest. So that's quite an interesting point when you think about the how financial instruments are used to the leverage effect to attract additional private financing and investments. Harmonizing approaches and durable solutions. Harmonizing approaches is an interesting one, especially with the previous case study I was looking at. There were 9 service providers in total providing a range of services to refugees and migrants in Finland, each with their own sort of expertise. Some were focused on individuals that were highly educated with a university degree. Some were focused on those that had a little bit of experience, perhaps in the manufacturing or hospitality sector there. So there's a lot of kind of different approaches there, and small service providers offering different services. So perhaps a little bit tricky to harmonize approaches across the board and to ensure kind of similar standards. As I mentioned, you have the CRF. So the ideas behind the CRF was to provide for a more predictable and comprehensive response to mass migration. So premised on 2 facts, really. Low and middle income countries shoulder much of the responsibility for refugees, and global response to large-scale movements remains inadequate and underfunded, leaving refugees with an uncertain future. And that's, if for me, from like a European perspective, from an EU perspective, that's the real entry point for financial instruments, for SIBs and for microfinance. So it's predicated on the idea that refugees should be included in communities from the very beginning. And there's a focus on access to education and labor markets. So people can acquire skills, become self-reliant and resilient. They can contribute to local economies and to the development of the communities hosting them. And that's supported by the Global Compact and the 2030 agenda. There's this kind of narrative that's becoming stronger over time that refugees should be viewed more as labor migrants, as economic actors within a host society who can and should contribute. And the idea behind behind refugee finance, behind these instruments, is to target kind of sections of that population with the skills to allow them to then to become sort of to become useful, valuable members of society who can contribute contribute taxes, who receive less in benefits. That's kind of the narrative that's pushed forward with social impact bonds, and certainly there's a degree of success for individuals that have that have that expertise and can engage with those programs. So yeah, the GCR talks about the mobilization of public-private funding is key to the successful implementation, and the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach has really been emphasized in recent years. The importance of civil society partners in the private sector. So for a social impact bond, you have the government agency that puts out a tender for applications. You have the fund manager that works alongside investors and the government to define the outcomes and the KPIs. And then you have a range of private investors, and then you have service providers and evaluators. So really, refugee finance embodies that multi-stakeholder approach that is sort of being pushed right by these legal frameworks. So some of the key objectives of the GCR, the real kind of big one for me, I suppose, at the minute would be the second. So enhancing refugee self-reliance, important from an integration perspective, and that's been my primary focus for the past year and a bit, and that's what I'm trying to understand during this period of fieldwork. So yeah, the EU. I was at a conference recently about financial instruments, and this was one of the quotes from one of the DGs. The days of grants and RRF are over. So what the EU essentially wants to do in the next programming period, which budget period from 2028 to 2035, I believe, is there's this idea that there would be a little bit more money, but they want to do a lot more with that. So financial instruments, private financing coming on board is viewed as key there. And you have the Asylum Migration Integration Fund, which is kind of the core funding at an EU level. So yeah, 9.88 billion for 21 to 27, increasing to 12 billion in 28 to 34. So the aims develop a common European asylum system, including the external dimension. That could be something I would also focus on in the future, perhaps. Developing legal migration in accordance with socioeconomic needs, countering irregular migration, solidarity, and fair sharing. So you see this idea of this kind of perception of refugees and migrants as economic actors who can contribute, who can pay tax, who shouldn't be receiving as much in benefits, perhaps as they are now. And how do we facilitate that through microloans to entrepreneurs, through social impact bonds that assist people with their entry into the labour market, and also promoting blended operations defined by public-private partnerships. So, and yeah, within that, member states, of course, are encouraged to increase private stakeholder participation in integration measures. You have DG Regio Home, which is behind the PAFMI microfinance projects, and they're always kind of talking to member states, trying to get them interested in these different models. So, enter the pact. I'll just say a little bit about this. So, 4 pillars: secured external borders, fast and efficient procedures, solidarity and responsibility, migration, and international partnerships. And there's this kind of growing interest in how private financing can be used to promote legal pathways, to promote labor pathways for refugees, and also at the external border. So yeah, just you can see there sort of clearly under effective system of solidarity and responsibility, there's this focus on operational and financial support. And it's interesting, right? Within that pillar, you have that, but you also have preventing secondary movements, clear rules and responsibility for asylum applications, and it's becoming increasingly clear this isn't a new concept at all, but that how integration is perceived as it's also along it also matches up with externalization and this idea of border management within the European Union. So as I was saying there, integration alongside external border control. So in May of 25, the Commission adopted an additional 3 billion to support member states implementing the pact. Really interesting there is that this was so it included a top up of 1.2 billion for AMIF and also the border management and visa instrument. So migration integration there with AMIF and the border management and visa instrument, more sort of on the external border control, are increasingly considered together to stop irregular departures and promote complementary pathways, promote integration through these financial instruments, through microfinance, through social impact bonds. So there are two specific objectives there. So with the BMVI, facilitate legitimate border crossings, manage migratory movements, and to facilitate legitimate travel. So yes, I get to talk to you a little bit about the case studies, which is great. So I have a comparative case study approach. There are two social impact bonds and two microfinance instruments. The first one, the Koto SIB in Finland, and the Geo for a Job SIB in Belgium, and then the partnerships and financing for migrant inclusion in Belgium, facilitated by MicroStart, and the Netherlands by Credits. I'm using semi-structured interviews. So I've talked with government actors, financial actors, service providers, and evaluators. This is the first phase of the fieldwork. So I have interviews across those four case studies in Finland, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. The idea and hope is that there'll be a second phase whereby I'll go back and look at the findings and then design questions targeted towards that if there's anything that we need further sort of clarification on. So the Koto SIB was launched in 2017 to support the integration of migrants into Finnish society. It's important, to maybe cast your mind back to that time. So over 30,000 asylum seekers were received in 2015, which is 10x the usual annual number. So quite significant for Finland, which doesn't really receive that many migrants or refugees. And of course, there are significant disparities between employment for migrants and native-born Finns. That was really clear with the ministry. That was the big concern there and how to address that effectively. And then further concerns around integration as well as public expenditure. So kind of the problems that were identified there really set up for a SIB model. What's the solution? So support integration of migrants into Finnish society. The Ministry for Economic Affairs launches a SIB approach. The idea is to provide jobs to over 2,500 migrants over a 3 years implementation period through services such as language training, career coaching, and specific work skills. It's important. It's interesting. The target group after 1 year was expanded. So initially there was a focus just on refugees, but there was a low uptake. Some of the feedback was that they would rather spend more time with the public service to engage longer with the language training offered within the Koto SIB. It was a much quicker process over a period of 6 months that was targeted specifically at the industry people were interested in. So depending on the service provider that they were with, they received that sort of targeted language training. And so immigrants had to exceed the 3 year integration period and be between the ages of 25 to 63. So I should mention, of course, that this is for people with recognized status. It's interesting there. So they had to be literate in their native language and Latin characters, and they could not be disabled. I haven't had much of an elaboration on what could not be disabled has meant, unfortunately, but it's the average participant for this project had been in Finland for 7 years. So quite a long period of time to already get used to the country, and perhaps they've had some issues engaging with the labor market, but often these people came with a good level of Finnish language into the program. So with something like this, it's good to have a bit of a visual aid. So the first stage, you have the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Employment and the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. So Sitra was responsible for the modelling of the social impact bond and assisting the Ministry for Economic Affairs with implementation and procurement. You have a fund manager there, Epicus OY, and they were bought over and they're now S Bank in Finland. They're everywhere, a huge financial institution there. Job is to identify potential investors, project monitoring. So they had a lot of meetings with the service providers during the course of the 2-year implementation, 3-year implementation period. And then investors, so providing upfront capital for service delivery. The European Investment Fund was the real anchor for this project at the time. There were a couple of individuals that were interested in this model in Sitra, and the feedback that I had is they went to a meeting at the Commission and the EIF were there, and they liked the presentation and decided that they wanted to experiment with this for refugee and migrant integration in Finland. And then you have a range of other sort of investors coming through there as well. The employment offices, so identifying participants for the service providers. And then there you have the list of providers. This is all available online publicly. So offering training and career coaching across various industries, hospitality, manufacturing, administration. So a little bit about the evaluation report. So participation in the SIB generated a benefit of approximately €2,670 for the public sector in terms of tax revenue and reduced social benefits, totaling €6.8 million. Interestingly, there was no return on investment for investors. This was due to the fact that there was insufficient uptake amongst migrants and refugees for the project. And scalability and repeatability of the experiment is viewed as a challenge. The operating environment has changed. It's more decentralized now in Finland, so it's harder to approach the ministry to set up a project like this. And there's an element of political decision making. At the time in 2017, it was, perceived that this would be a good thing to do for integration. The politics in Finland, as across the rest of Europe, has shifted quite substantially in that period, and I had a lot of people reflecting on the challenges that poses today. And not the most attractive model from an investor perspective, is viewed as excessively complex with planning, modeling, and organization of practical activities. And they emphasized that they would not have got involved with this experiment as a pure investment. So it's really focused on CSR and philanthropy to get people on board. So some sort of preliminary findings from the Koto SIB government agencies. So they were talking about a push to innovate the integration service and then further collaboration with central government and local employment offices. Trust was something that came up a lot in Finnish companies engaging as investors and operating as service providers. There were no formal requirements per se for an investor or a service provider to come on board to this process. So it gives you an idea of the sort of the level of trust in society there. There's difficulty in monitoring the soft effects of integration. So they're reflecting a bit on sociocultural knowledge and habits. And SIBs are viewed as a success for the public sector. However, it's difficult to implement in a complex structure, dependent on political will. And at the minute, there are no further plans for another SIB in Finland. So investors, there's no such thing as a social impact investment, only social impact speculation. It's one of the findings there from them. They stress the importance of philanthropy, the uncertainty around ethics of having a control group, and then political uncertainty. And some remarks that the government is too lazy and perhaps lacks the knowledge to implement a similar payment by results model or a future social impact bond. And then for service providers, the SIB is seen as a fast track to employment. There was an importance in having language teachers from a Finnish background and work coaches similar to the immigrant background. So someone reflecting that people under 35 of Arabic origin and men, that was something that people could relate to for their entry into the job market. It really interestingly, one of the providers mentioned that the state should remain responsible for those in a bad situation who may struggle to enter the labour market, single mothers, people with disabilities, or older people, and the importance of enabling people to find their value or worth. And of course, the need to showcase success stories. So those videos that you see where people talk about what they've done since engaging with the program and the employment they've managed to obtain. So some of the key themes that have come through there: value, skills based, proactive, hardworking, self reliance. So there's a real focus on the individual coming through here and how they can facilitate their integration into society. And perhaps it says something bigger about how protection is being understood, how it's being conceptualized here, if we're kind of putting the focus on individuals through these programs, through labor pathways as well. So I know I'm running a little bit tight on time, but I'm going to quickly take you through the PAFME projects. So I've just started the fieldwork here, and yeah, it's an initiative. Let me see. Yeah, led by the Council of Europe Development Bank and boosted by 3.5 billion euro from AMIF. The idea is to address four challenges faced by migrants: integration into labour markets, social inclusion and discrimination, education and training, administrative and legal barriers. There are four pilot projects implemented there. And so yeah, so you have for the first one in Belgium there. So providing microloans to foster the inclusion of migrants in Brussels through self-employment. Um, so so within this project, over 1,500 migrants were informed on how to start a business in Belgium, which organizations could assist. Close to 47% were women. 86 participated in collective training, individual business coaching, and then 48 gained access to microcredit to start and develop a business. And then also the credits project in the Netherlands. So 244 participants in 18 schools, operating across 55 municipalities. Only 4 loans were granted, dispersed to micro entrepreneurs. And yeah, so like the idea is that a lot of these projects can be successful for the individuals involved, but perhaps that the selective criteria, who can really be an entrepreneur, who comes with the skills to engage with the social impact bond, who has the sort of the B1, B2 level of language, who's been in the country for a few years. That's often the target of these projects, and it's sort of an emerging spectrum of refugeehood, which my PI Daria has written about, emerges from these projects, where you have on one end refugees and migrants who have the skills, the capabilities, the capacity to engage with microfinance, to engage with social impact bonds, and to have some success. But a vanishingly small number of people are capable of being an entrepreneur, and that's true of the general population as well. However, this is being presented as a really big solution for refugee integration across the EU, to view people as economic actors, and that's perhaps the big shift that's happening, and the impact that finance is having on that understanding of a refugee. And then I'm only a year into it, but the idea is with time is to understand what that means for international protection. So I thank you for your time. And yeah, if there are any questions or comments, I'd be grateful to hear them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher, for this really interesting presentation. So now if anyone has a question, you can either write it in the chat or directly ask with your microphone.
Maybe I can kick off while we wait for some of the others. So, yeah, so one of the things you already mentioned is, yeah, there's starting to be this push much more now towards the entrepreneurship program. So one issue I'm wondering about is scalability. I guess maybe of all of the programs, because on one hand, I mean, there are a lot of refugees that need economic integration, and these programs still seem relatively small. And then on the other hand, yeah, we've seen this story before, not only with refugees, but also if you look at return programs with trying to do entrepreneurship and kind of with the assumption that everyone can be in entrepreneurship. And as you already mentioned, well, that's not the case also for the local population. So, are the hopes a little bit misguided here? And what would scalability also look like in that regard? I mean, this is not to say don't have entrepreneurship programs, but
Yeah.
more, that perhaps the aspirations or the ideas about what can realistically come out of this are a bit misplaced. But just kind of, yeah, interested to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that, and if anyone that you've talked to in these programs is also concerned about that.
Yeah, scalability is a really interesting point there for microfinance. It's so the Pathway projects are effectively they're an example by the DG Regio Home and the Council of Europe Development Bank. Look, this is what we're doing with refugees under direct management through these programs. And these are really small. You're right. These are a few hundred thousand euros for each project. So really kind of small. But as far as scalability goes, I it's very hard. It's very hard to say at this stage if there's an appetite on the microfinance side, if there's an appetite from private investors to engage with something like this. These projects concluded in 2025, and ultimately the hope is that this is something that the private sector will now start to engage with, will be interested in when they see the results, when they see the social impact. Whether that's borne out in reality, I have I have my doubts. Even when you look at the SIB model, investors are talking about that. They talk about as philanthropy. It's an act of sort of charity, giving some money to this experiment. And for microfinance as well, there is definitely that concern. These projects, they weren't just about providing microloans. They provided training services, education. It was a whole program for people. Whether institutions are really interested in scaling that up and bearing the upfront cost of providing those services to train people to start a business. I have my doubts. Time will tell if this becomes something that is more interesting. But I suppose at an EU level, the the thing here is that this is being sort of pushed as the answer to a lot of the issues, to issues with integration, to push this idea of the self-reliant economic actor, and that's how integration should be facilitated. And when you have this increasingly narrow understanding of what integration looks like, it leaves really big questions for the 90 odd percent of people who don't qualify as an entrepreneur, who perhaps
Hmm.
haven't been in the country for 7 years. And as far as sort of concerns go, I haven't had any interviews yet on the microfinance side. I would say that on the investor side for the SIB, yeah, that would have been the main concern. It's not a realistic investment for them. But there's big disparities when you talk to different actors. Because if you talk to the government agency, like it's the investors are really interested, like, and this is something that can go out to the market and as a regular product. But then when you go and talk to these people, the reality, the two different worlds, I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I understand. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? So I actually do have a question,
Yeah, go
which is
ahead.
really, so do you plan on having more interviews maybe with people that actually have participated to these programs? And how do you think you will structure these interviews? So what are you interested in looking and asking them? And yeah, if you maybe foresee any result already.
And
Yeah.
maybe as a
So
follow-up, can I follow up that question with, have you thought about also looking at some of these in a more longitudinal design, right? So looking at the impact, of these programs 1 year after people have finished them, for example.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. So, so for the refugee finance project participants, they aren't considered for interviews across the board. The two sort of reasons for that. It's very difficult to ask a refugee or a migrant, what do you think about this legal structure for a bond for microfinance, which is what we're trying to sort of test in this project, and then connect it to international law development and financing. So it would prove a little bit difficult, asking people, oh, what do you think about these private investors, assisting with this model. That would be the challenge for this project. I would say that there'd be a lot of value perhaps going forward at some later date in the future to incorporate those perspectives, but building the building my research now and for the purposes of the Refugee project, it's not a target group. And as far as a more longitudinal design, I suppose, with the second phase of fieldwork, the idea is to go back after a year and to test some of the findings. It'll also be interesting for the microfinance projects because they only concluded last year and the evaluation is only recently out. So perhaps to see if they have kept up with their engagement with refugee and migrant communities by themselves, if they're still able to offer the same services without that funding from AMIF. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Any other questions?
I know that several of the people in the call have been working with refugees themselves also, or asylum seekers, and in integration issues too. So thought there might be some more questions from the kind of practical side, but perhaps not.
Okay. Yeah, like if you guys have any questions, you want to learn more about the research, you have my email address there, and you said it'd be uploaded to YouTube, is that right? So
Mhm.
Yes, we will.
it'll be available. So yeah, please, if you have any reflections on the project, please feel free to reach out. And it'd be nice to chat to you. But listen, thanks so much for agreeing to host me today. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Christopher, for presenting. I think it's a really interesting perspective on these instruments. Maybe if there are no other questions, we can wrap up here. So thank you, everyone. And as also we have already mentioned, this seminar will be uploaded on our unu-merit YouTube channel, so you can also find the presentation and the slides. And Christopher's email if you have questions for him. So thank you, everyone, for attending today. Thank you, Christopher, again for presenting, and we will see you at the next seminar. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.